Hi, everybody. Welcome to Insights from Case Text. I'm Mike Whalen here in the WeWork Kansas City studios. Today, I am talking to one of my friends, Kat Moon, in a series on writing. Kat, thanks for joining us.
Hey.
Usually when I start these conversations, I like to let people rant a little bit because in YouTube videos, people's attention span is about this long.
Yeah.
So if you can just rant for a minute, let me know what's on your mind. Then we'll dig into it. How's that?
That sounds awesome. I'm pretty good at ranting, if you ask my teenage children. So, we had some communication before this conversation and you cued me in that you were going to invite me to rant. And so I'm thinking there are a whole lot of things I can rant about because I'm really interested in helping the legal profession, be better. But I'll focus on the topic at hand, writing. So I actually had lunch yesterday with one of the legal writing professors at Vanderbilt. And it was a really interesting conversation on a whole lot of levels, but it really affirmed for me how important kind of that bedrock experience in law school is for really giving lawyers the tools they need in order to just be excellent writers. And I know we're going to dig into this later in the conversation, but I think that is one of our superpowers, right? To have the ability to really build understanding, and help educate people through what we write. And certainly technical proficiency is very, very important, but that's just really one piece of the skill set when it comes to writing that lawyers need. And so I guess my rant is, I just wish that we could, really be better at communicating not only the technical legal stuff that we need to communicate, but really in translating that for a wider audience and, making this information and this knowledge more accessible. And so many lawyers are really doing that, blogging and, how they put themselves out on social media, on Twitter. There are a number of people who do a fabulous job there, but, it really is a superpower. And I wish that we, put more value on it because I think it's incredibly valuable. So that's my rant.
Well, so as you know, I've been writing a book, and in the book, one of the questions is, what does it mean to be a lawyer? We have this thing with law school, and you teach at a law school now, that we have kind of one education path for a whole lot of career paths, which suggests either we're really bad at figuring out education or there's some fundamental core to lawyering. And so in the book, I kind of explored what I think that is. And the way I defined it is we use the tools of rhetoric to purposely preserve humanity, right? So,
okay.
Yeah. So to me, that communication that you're talking about is fundamental to what we do. So, but tell me quickly about your background. You teach at Vanderbilt now, you mentioned, but you didn't start out in the academic track. Is that right?
No. So interesting that you mentioned rhetoric. So I actually have a BA and a master's in human communication. And so I study rhetoric, for most of my academic career before law school. So, for me, the communication piece really is incredibly fundamental. And that was my orientation when I came to law school. So I went to law school, graduated 21 years ago this year. I practiced law for about 20 years before I made the switch to teach at Vanderbilt, which is my alma mater twice. And, I practicing law for 20 years. I did some different things, but, I bring all of that to my teaching now. And the teaching is so much fun. So I have to say, I'm really having a good time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe it's the dynamic of student loans, but as a lawyer, when people pay you, they're kind of mean to you sometimes. They expect a lot. Students, there's kind of this nice, well, you're here to help me, even though law school is way more expensive than any legal services I ever sold. But that's a different conversation. I did want to ask you, because I know that you're working on a model that describes lawyers that's flexible that I like. So we historically have this idea of the T-shaped lawyer, this broad, shallow understanding of a lot of areas and then a deep understanding of one area. That's the T. But you've been working with some other people on developing a different model. Tell me about that, because it relates to what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, so it's the Delta model for lawyer competency, really legal professional competency. We don't want to pigeonhole it just for lawyers, because part of our fundamental belief is that the legal ecosystem needs to include a much broader and more expansive understanding of roles to provide legal service and legal understanding. So I want to make that point very clear. So the Delta model is a triangle, Delta, and the base is legal understanding, legal research, writing, what we would consider the traditional fundamentals. One side represents business competencies, and that would include technology and data analytics. The third side represents what many people call the soft skills. I call them the core human skills. Those things that really differentiate us from machines who will be able to master the other two sides in some respects, pretty fundamentally. And that would include emotional intelligence, really our ability to communicate, empathy, those things that are unique to human interaction and human judgment. So, I think in that way, it's much more expansive than just simply the T-shape, and has that clear place and role for the human aspects. As well, it is dynamic in that the center point for the triangle can shift based on the role you're serving. So if we agree there's a spectrum of roles to be served, then certain roles need different quantities of different skills, even though all are present in some respect.
Yeah, it's when I came onto Case Text early on, one of the things that we tried to figure out is what kind of lawyers we serve, because that group is so broad. And the more I dug into it with the leadership, the more we realized that the people we serve are the people who focus on the craft of lawyering, lawyers who want a lawyer. And when I think about that Delta model, it's really hard to describe for people who, you should go check this thing out. But the idea is that this center point pivots with the different roles. So sometimes, as you mentioned, it focuses more on the technical skills, the lawyers who want a lawyer skills. Some roles require more business competency, and these different, the limitation of the T-shaped lawyer is that it has this prescriptive model that seems to apply to everyone, but that's not really true. As you mentioned, different roles require totally different relationships with the different competencies.
Yes.
Yeah, so I really like that model. Related to that, one of the things that I've asked a lot of people I've talked to recently is how fundamental writing is as a discipline to lawyering writ large, however we describe that. Again, to me, it's using rhetoric to purposely design and preserve our humanity. I was talking to Pablo at Case Text, and he noted that for this central legal education that covers a lot of career paths, the one skill that we teach literally everyone is legal research and writing. How fundamental do you think that exercise is to people who call themselves lawyer and engage in this work of preserving humanity?
Well, so I think communication is fundamental to what we do, and writing is really our stock in trade. So I almost don't see how you can talk about lawyering without talking about writing.
Yeah, in Foonberg's book, since you've had your own practice, you probably know Jay Foonberg's book about starting and writing a practice or running a practice. In the middle of it, at some point, he says, what lawyers sell is paper. And for a lot of reasons, I don't like that phrase. But in truth, in terms of the deliverable to the client, to the proof that we have insights and we're delivering them, usually is writing. But there are restrictions with the billable hour. The billable hour tells us to do things that we know will work. And I know you've been thinking about failure in the context of lawyering. I heard a quote from Brene Brown's Netflix special this morning that she said, show me a culture where failure is demonized, and I will show you a culture that lacks creativity. Yeah. Tell me about the relationship between the willingness to fail, to produce writing that might not be great or ideas that might not be great, and creativity in the legal industry.
So, absent permission and safe place to not do things perfectly, we cannot be creative and we cannot innovate. I think that perfection is absolutely the enemy of innovation. And I agree wholeheartedly with Brene Brown. I think it's frankly one of the greatest barriers we face right now in this profession, because we are so rigid in our approach, and perfectionism comes at us from every possible point. So that just completely puts a lid on our ability to try new things when we don't know if they will work. So innovation, change that creates value, demands experimentation. And running an experiment means you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
It might not work out. And so you commit to the journey and learning what you can from that journey. And I mean, you can look at any innovation that has changed the world. It is a path full of things that didn't work, right? And so if we want to meaningfully move forward, we have to say, you know what? We're going to try this. Now we take calculated risks. It's not, you can do these things very intentionally and intelligently. But you have to commit to the process. The other important thing when you talk about creativity, how you get to like the best idea, the best solution, you have to throw a lot of things against the wall, and a lot of those things aren't going to stick, but you have to give yourself permission to talk about all of it and put it all out there. And we just are so afraid of exposing ourselves as not being all knowing. And it's, and I just have to make this point because I think this is critical. I think that connection right there leads to so much of the mental unwellness that
Sure.
we face in our profession. It is just hard baked into the culture, and it is supported and enforced by our rules. So,
You're touching into a lot of the myths about success that are modern, maybe American, maybe lawyerish, to the point that we discount things like luck and timing, and we assign moral value in this success doctrine, this idea that you're a bad person or you're a bad lawyer if you tried this experiment and you didn't make millions the next day. But that gets into a complicated issue. To pull it back to writing, because I think it's relevant, I have encouraged lawyers, and I've seen people say this to writers, you have to get in the habit of writing poorly. If you want to write well, you have to get in the habit of writing poorly. Tell me what you think about that. What is the value in having a daily writing habit, even if writing poorly?
So I think the value is tremendous in creating a daily writing habit. And if you look at, I think, any great writer and dig into how they write, most will reveal that they definitely have a daily writing habit. I will say from my own experience, writing daily has been just an incredible creative outlet to keep those creative juices flowing, which can, for the reasons we just discussed, kind of be, stifled by the normal practice of law. I think as well that you only get better at something by doing it. And often you have to do something poorly for a long, 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 long time. I don't know that I ascribe to the 10,000 hour rule to become, expert in something, but you most certainly improve just simply by doing it, right? So I once did Nanowrimo. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's National Writing Month. And so you write a 50,000 word novel in a month, in the month of November. And I did that with my sister, and it was tremendous because I wrote like 2,500 words a day. It was crazy, but the single most effective thing I've ever done to really take my writing to another level. And I probably would never want anyone to read the novel that I wrote. But that proves that goes exactly to my point. It's the process, not the outcome that you're seeking. So, and I would say this, that if you are kind of a disciplined person who can establish habit, I think it's awesome to just say, I'm going to spend the first 30 minutes of every day just writing. Do the morning pages exercise or journal. There are a number of different ways you can approach that, but also just carry a notebook around with you. If you're early to an appointment, that's 10 minutes that you can just sit and write. And so I think it's like the single easiest thing just to fit into a schedule, even if you think you have no time.
Yeah, I don't know if this was true for you in your practice, but in my practice, I would only write for the court up to a dozen times a year, right? Like that, it was not a daily activity. And just by, like you mentioned, the nature of practice, if I'm only doing something half a dozen times a year, by definition, I can't do it well. And yet the clients expect high quality work and the judges expect high quality work, and those stakes are very real. So yeah, I really think we have a responsibility to write daily, even if you can't bill it. Like, I really think that's important.
Yes.
I know you post a lot, especially on Twitter, poetry that you've read. I know you're a big poetry reader. Tell me about why you think reading poetry, and not just reading passively, but really getting into poetry, how can that help somebody become a better legal writer?
So poetry is all about creating a very rich experience with economy of words. And so poetry really demands that you are very efficient in your use of words, and you both construct structure and choose words to convey as much meaning and emotion in as tight a space as possible, right? And so that's just incredibly valuable, I think, to consume writing that is constructed that way. And I very much think it can inform how we write for a client, for a court. I believe there is nothing more beautiful than an incredibly rich and powerful message delivered as tightly and as efficiently as possible, right? And the other beautiful thing about poetry, I think, that it teaches us about writing is how to combine structure. So when we are writing, whether it's to persuade a court or to convey information to a client, or for any purpose, we have a purpose for our writing. And so to approach it intentionally and think, how can I structure this content to have the most powerful impact possible? And often just reading a very beautiful poem can reveal, some real power about structure that I think people should be more open to. So,
yeah, I think we think of poetry as flowery, and we're seeing this trend. I talked to Ross Guberman about this. We're seeing this trend of whether you call it flowery or cutesy or too self-referential or too pop culture, the noise that's coming into legal writing. But really, like you mentioned, poetry is not about being flowery. It's about being economical, to use the old Bill Shakespeare line that brevity is the soul of wit, and not letting our words get in the way of the message. One of my kids one time asked me, what do lawyers do? And when we go to court, and I said, we do our best to not get in the way of the story. And really, when the facts become not the focus, when the story becomes not the focus, but we do, our clothes, our manner of speaking, our aggressiveness, our words, when that gets in the way of what's being delivered, that's kind of the living opposite of poetry. So if you don't want to read poetry, go read some Hemingway. Just be more economical with your language. I also wanted to ask you, because I know you write and talk a lot about design thinking. It's a big subject, but in the briefest way possible, tell me about design thinking and how that can impact how we plan our writing.
So at its core, design thinking requires the person creating, let's just say creating the content. So in this case, the writer, to put herself in the shoes of the person or people she's writing for. And so I think that's to me a fundamental rule of effective communication, right? If you want to move someone, to the position you are taking, then you need to put yourself in the shoes of that person and craft your communication, to do that from their perspective. And so I would say just that fundamental rule, right, from a place of empathy. And empathy really in two ways. One, empathy, intellectual empathy. So just understanding what is their worldview, what is their perspective. And two, there's nothing wrong. And I think this goes to the poetry point about crafting an emotionally powerful argument, right? That often can be a really important part of the story we're telling. And so I think we need to give ourselves permission to include that element when it's relevant and it helps us convey what we want to convey.
I think in court, what I've told students that I've talked to is you're trying to do two things. You're trying to get the judge to want to find for your client, and then give them a legal path by which they can find for your client. And we're pretty good at that technical part of giving them the legal path. But when we don't, like you said, imagine the emotional journey that the judge has to go through from, I don't care about this, or I'm more sympathetic to this other argument. If we don't imagine that journey from where they are to where we want them to be emotionally, we can't write that into our argument. So I definitely think that design, thinking of that process really helps. I also wanted to ask you just a few maybe quicker questions. These bits are typically used for the podcast. They're kind of the take-home message. So let me ask some direct questions, and hopefully they're not too huge. So first I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, is writing fundamental to good lawyering?
I believe it's our stock in trade. So yes.
That's as brief as it gets.
There's a brief. There
was the soul of wit right there. Thank you. Law schools, in my experience, the legal writing class was kind of I had a great legal writing professor. You probably know Wayne Sheese at Texas, or at least know who he is. And Wayne Sheese is a fantastic professor, but there wasn't a lot of emphasis, especially on that first year writing class, because there were all those doctrinal classes that determined whether I got a job or not. What can law schools do to put more emphasis on that skill of writing?
So I think both the easiest and the hardest solution to that challenge is to actually reimagine the law school curriculum to integrate skills with doctrine, right? So if you were actually teaching doctrine by requiring students to be using and exercising the tools and developing the skills, then those things would actually evolve in a way that is how it works in practice. And in saying that, I don't mean to suggest that we in any way diminish the doctrine, that approach, or the content. It's simply redesigning how it is delivered and structured. So I think that
if I'm understanding you correctly, someone can learn the doctrine through writing about it, as opposed to learning by reading a casebook and then listening to a lecture in class. It's just a different way to teach the same substance. Is that right?
I think that the substance could be taught in part by integrating the opportunity to write. And interestingly, I've had more than one writing professor talk about the fact that in teaching writing kind of in this siloed way, they actually are also teaching doctrine. The students have to have a certain sort of level of knowledge in order to complete a writing exercise that's kind of floating over here by itself, separated from the doctrine they're studying. So in so many ways, it makes so much sense. I recognize that in most schools, it's simply not approached that way. And most folks aren't really motivated to completely rework how that is approached. But
it's hard to put 150 kids in a room and bill them $30,000 a year if you have them doing these more interactive experiences. So,
yeah, well, it's, it really is project-based learning. And it applies at the graduate adult learning level, just as it does, at earlier points in our education. So, but yeah, there are a lot of sacred cows in legal education, and what I'm suggesting would massacre many of them. And so, yeah,
right,
probably not going to happen anytime soon. But
Kat, I want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
You and I have been in the solo context, and we know the pressure of feeling that churn, right? Like you just have to get to the next case in the next hour, the next thing, and that constant burn. And so when I tell someone who I really sympathize with as a solo, you need to make time to improve your writing craft, I totally understand why that bounces right off.
Right.
In your mind, how would you encourage someone who's in that solo small context, in that churn environment, to make time for improving their writing craft?
Well, the simplest way is simply to schedule time on your calendar. You just, 30 minutes, 3 times a week, whatever works. It's an appointment with yourself. I think that's how you handle really getting anything done. I think it's fundamental to creating a proactive versus reactive way of working. And I think it's critical too that as professionals, we create that space to develop ourselves and to hone our craft. I think it's frankly a professional responsibility, but it also is incredibly rewarding. And so I think that if you can, I suggest run a small experiment, right? Carve out 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week on your calendar, and you will find that it improves your craft. And I also think it will feed your soul. So that's my
without really impacting things as emergency-ish as we think it's going to, right? Most lawyers don't like that answer, but the reality for me anyway was I was never as busy as I said I was, right? If I design my day and if I start cutting out the things that aren't having impact, there's a great book on this, by the way, called Essentialism, which I'm a huge fan of and I recommend.
Greg
love
McCown.
that book. Great book. If you start cutting out the things that aren't having that impact, you'll find you have a lot more time for the high impact things like improving your craft, like writing. So I'm a big fan of that. Kat, I appreciate you. If people want to get a hold of you to learn more, I know you've got a lot of projects going on and a conference coming up people should go to. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Sure. So I'm at Inspired Cat on Twitter, and I have a website related to my human-centered design course at Vanderbilt called legalproblemsolving.org. And that site has my contact info on it as well. So, I love to talk with people. So I invite folks to reach out.
Perfect, Kat. I appreciate you. And thank you to all our viewers for watching Insights from Case Text. We will see you next time when we talk more about writing.